Welcome to the quietest corner of the village. We knew you'd find us eventually.
Chapter 1. The petal and the pride Agatha Raisin squinted into her gilt-edged mirror, tugging at the skin around her jawline. The Cotswold sun was streaming through the windows of her cottage in Carsely, illuminating every line that 50-odd years of London stress and expensive gin had etched onto her face. "Damn it," she muttered, reaching for a pot of remarkably overpriced, age-defying radiance cream. She was in a foul mood, and for several very good reasons. Firstly, the temperature was soaring, and her chic black linen suit perfect for a power lunch in Mayfair was currently acting like a personal sauna. Secondly, James Lacey, her handsome and infuriatingly aloof neighbour, had spent the morning helping Penelope larch with her trellises. Penelope was a newcomer to the village, a woman of 40, who managed to look like a botanical illustration, even when covered in manure. But the primary source of Agatha's irritation was the Carsely Ladies' Society annual flower show. Agatha had entered the exotic bloom category. In a moment of typical impulsiveness and social desperation, she had driven all the way to a specialist nursery in London, purchased a magnificent deep purple Vanda orchid, and spent the last 3 days frantically misting it while praying it wouldn't die before the judging. It was cheating, of course, but Agatha viewed gardening more as a PR exercise than a hobby. If she won, James would surely see her as a woman of hidden, earthy depths. "Come on, you miserable weed," she snapped at the orchid, which sat regally in a ceramic pot. "Look expensive, look victorious." She gathered the pot in her arms and marched out of the cottage. The village green was a riot of colour and repressed hostility. Great white marquees billowed in the heat, and the air was thick with the scent of mown grass, heavy roses, and the distinct undercurrent of sheep droppings. As she entered the main tent, Agatha was met by a wall of humidity and the sound of Doris Simpson, the village's most tireless gossip, trilling about runner beans. "Oh, Agatha, you've brought—" "An orchid," Doris said, her eyes narrowing as she took in the vibrant, clearly professional bloom. "How very ambitious. Most of us stuck to things that actually grow in this climate." "It's a statement piece, Doris," Agatha snapped, her heels sinking into the soft turf. "Something Carsely could use a bit more of." "Where is the judging table?" "Down the end, near the preserves," Doris said, leaning in closer. "Have you seen Arthur Pringle? He's the head judge this year. Dreadful man. He's already disqualified Mary Fortune's jam for being insufficiently set." She was in tears behind the Victoria sponges. Agatha ignored her and pushed through the crowd. She spotted James Lacey standing by a display of prize-winning marigolds. He looked cool and crisp in a beige safari jacket, the very picture of retired military elegance. Her heart gave its usual inconvenient thud. "Hello, James," she said, trying for a tone of breezy sophistication while sweating profusely. "Agatha, remarkable flower," James said, peering at the orchid. "Isn't that a tropical species? Difficult to cultivate in a Cotswold cottage, I imagine." Agatha felt a flush that had nothing to do with the sun. "It's all in the humidity control, James. I have a very delicate touch." "Quite," he said, his eyes wandering toward Penelope Larch, who was currently laughing at something the vicar had said. Agatha's triumph was curdling. She slammed her orchid down on the judging table next to a row of modest begonias. At the head of the table stood Arthur Pringle. He was a man who looked like a disgruntled toad squat, balding with a permanent scowl that suggested he found the very existence of flowers an affront to public decency. He held a clipboard like a weapon of war. "Mrs. Raisin," Pringle barked, not looking up. "The exotic category is for plants grown by the exhibitor, not purchased from a Chelsea florist 48 hours ago." The surrounding crowd went silent. Agatha felt the heat of 20 pairs of eyes. "I beg your pardon," Agatha puffed out her chest. "I have nurtured this plant for months. The soil is still damp with London tap water, Agatha." Pringle sneered, finally looking at her through thick spectacles. "And I recognize the nursery stake. Disqualified."
"Oh."
"You pompous little tyrant." Agatha's voice rose to a shrill pitch. "You wouldn't know a prize-winning bloom if it bit you on your bulbous nose." "Rules are rules," Pringle said, dismissively turning his back to her. He reached for a small glass of elderflower cordial that had been set out for the judges. "Now, if y'all excuse me, I have the roses to attend to." A far more honest flower. Agatha stood there, trembling with rage, her social standing evaporating with every snicker from the sidelines. She watched as Pringle took a long, greedy gulp of the cordial. He stopped mid-swallow. His face, already a sickly shade of grey, turned a startling bruised purplenot, unlike Agatha's orchid. He let out a wet, rattling sound, his hands clutching at his throat. The glass shattered on the grass, the pale yellow liquid soaking into the earth. "Mr. Pringle?" the vicar asked, stepping forward. Pringle didn't answer. His eyes rolled back, and he collapsed forward, his head landing with a sickening thud directly into Mrs. Forbes Hamilton's prize-winning display of peace roses. For a moment the Marquis was silent, save for the buzzing of a confused bumblebee. Then the screaming began. Agatha stood frozen, her hand still hovering near her disqualified orchid. She looked at the slumped form of the man who had just humiliated her. Her first thought wasn't of tragedy or grief. Well, she thought with a sharp, involuntary twitch of her lips, "At least I don't have to listen to his comments on my begonias." But as the village doctor rushed forward and the crowd surged in a wave of panic, Agatha's PR-trained brain began to whir. A death at the flower show? It was scandalous. It was inconvenient. And, looking at the strange bitter foam flecking Pringle's lips, it looked remarkably like murder. "Stay back, everyone," Agatha shouted, her voice cutting through the hysteria. She didn't know why she said it, she just knew that she was suddenly, inexplicably, in charge. Nobody touched that glass. "James, call the police." She looked down at Arthur Pringle. He had died being a bully, and he had died ruinously for the Carsely social calendar. It was a terrible start to the summer, but as Agatha glanced at the terrified, guilty and shocked faces of her neighbours, she felt a familiar, predatory spark of curiosity. The orchid was disqualified, but the game was just beginning. Chapter 2. Elderflower and Enmity, the Carsely village green, usually the site of peaceful cricket matches and the occasional stray sheep, was now a swarm of high-visibility jackets and yellow tape. The great white marquee, once a temple to horticulture, had become a crime scene. Inside, the scent of prize-winning lilies was being aggressively overtaken by the medicinal tang of latex gloves and the sour smell of a very public expiration. Agatha Raisin sat on a folding wooden chair just outside the tent entrance, her cream linen dress now hopelessly grass-stained at the hem. She was nursing a lukewarm cup of tea provided by the Women's Institute, though she would have vastly preferred a stiff gin and tonic. "Disgraceful," she muttered to herself, though she made sure she was loud enough for James Lacey to hear. He was standing a few feet away, looking toward the hills with an expression of stoic detachment that Agatha found both attractive and deeply annoying. To die in the middle of the judging. It's so dramatic, so attention-seeking. James turned his head slightly, his brow furrowing. "The man is dead, Agatha. I hardly think he timed it for the theatrical effect." "Oh, you didn't know Arthur Pringle like I did," Agatha snapped, conveniently forgetting Shed only met him twice. "He lived to ruin things for people. He disqualified my orchid, James. A plant that cost Methatwa spent hours nurturing. And then he has the gall to drop dead before I can properly demand an appeal. It's professionally discourteous." Before James could respond, the flap of the marquee pushed open and Detective Inspector Wilkes emerged. Wilkes was a man who looked like he had been assembled from left a versa bulbous nose, a suit that didn't quite fit, and a permanent air of being slightly behind on his paperwork. His face clouded the moment he spotted Agatha. Mrs. Raisin, Wilkes sighed, the sound echoing the weariness of a man who had dealt with too many accidental poisonings in Agatha's vicinity. "I might have known. Wherever there's a corpse and a ruffled social calendar, you're usually hovering nearby like a chic vulture." Agatha drew herself up, her dark eyes flashing. "I was a witness, Inspector, a victim of his verbal abuse, in fact. I'm merely staying behind to assist the authorities. It's called civic duty. You should try it sometime." "What you should try, Mrs. Raisin, is going home and staying out of the way," Wilkes countered. He gestured vaguely toward the tent. "It looks like a clear case of anaphylaxis, or perhaps a sudden cardiac event. The man was practically made of bile. It was bound to happen." "He turned purple, Inspector," Agatha said, leaning forward conspiratorially. "The colour of my orchid. And that foam. People don't just foam at the mouth because they are grumpy. Someone put something in that elderflower cordial." Wilkes rolled his eyes. The cordial was communal. Everyone had some. Pringle had his own glass, Agatha pointed out sharply. It was sitting right there on the judge's podium. And he was the only one who drank from it. "Well, test the glass, naturally," Wilkes said, though he looked like he'd rather test Agatha's patience further. "Now, please, move along. You're blocking the path for the stretcher." Agatha stood up, smoothing her dress with jerky, irritated movements. She watched as they wheeled Pringle out, his feet poking out from under the white sheet. The village was already buzzing. Small clusters of people stood around the perimeter of the green, their heads bobbing together in a synchronized rhythm of speculation. she spotted Mrs. Bloxby, the vicar's wife, standing near the lich gate of the church. Miss Bloxby was the only person in Carsely who truly understood Agatha, mostly because she possessed the patience of a saint and the observational skills of a hawk. "A terrible business, Agatha," Mrs. Bloxby said softly as Agatha approached. "It's a PR nightmare for the village, that's what it is," Agatha replied, though her eyes were darting around, scanning the crowd. "Who do you think did it?" "My money is on Mary Fortune." She looked like she wanted to prune him with her pinking shears after he insulted her jam. "Mary is a very sensitive soul," Mrs. Bloxby murmured. "But then, Arthur was remarkably unkind to everyone today. Did you see the way he spoke to young Peter Higgins? The boy spent months growing those pumpkins, and Arthur told him they looked like diseased footballs." Agatha's ears pricked up. "Peter Higgins? The one who works at the garage? He's got a temper, hasn't he?" "He's a young man with a lot of pride," Mrs. Bloxby said neutrally. Agatha felt the familiar itch of a burgeoning investigation. It was better than sitting at home worrying about the skin on her neck. "And what about the cordial, Mrs. Bloxby? Who was in charge of the refreshments?" Mrs. Bloxby paused, her gaze shifting toward the tea tent. "Usually it's a roster, but today the cordial was provided by the Carsely Clean Living Group. They are very keen on natural ingredients. Penelope Larch is the chairperson." Agatha felt a jolt of pure, unadulterated spite. Penelope Larch, the woman with the perfect trellises, the woman James had been helping all morning. Penelope Larch, Agatha repeated, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "How very organic of her. I think he'll go and offer her my condolences. It must be so embarrassing to have your clean drinks associated with a messy death." "Agatha," Mrs. Bloxby warned gently, "do try not to accuse her of murder before the sun goes down. It's considered poor form." "I am just being neighbourly," Agatha said, already turning away. Her stride was purposeful now, her heels clicking rhythmically on the pavement. She caught sight of James again. He was talking to Penelope, who was dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief that looked suspiciously expensive. Penelope looked fragile, blonde, and utterly pathetic. Agatha felt a wave of nausea. She wasn't just going to solve this murder. She was going to solve it better, faster, and more stylishly than the police. And she was going to make sure that if Penelope Larch so much as accidentally dropped a grain of hemlock into that cordial, the whole world and especially James Lacey would know about it. "Watch out, Carsely," Agatha whispered to the warm afternoon air. "The judge might be dead, but the jury is still out, and she's wearing black linen." Chapter 3. Bitter herbs and sweet talk. Agatha Raisin marched toward the refreshment tent with the determination of a heat-seeking missile. The crowds were thinning, but the atmosphere remained thick with the delicious dark electricity of a local scandal. People weren't mourning Arthur Pringle, they were dissecting him. Standing by a trestle table laden with half-eaten scones and jugs of amber liquid was Penelope Larch. She was leaning rather too heavily, in Agatha's opinion, on the arm of James Lacey. Penelope's eyes were artfully rimmed with red, and she was clutching a damp handkerchief as if it were a holy relic. "It's just so public," Penelope sobbed softly. "Ah, to think that my elderflower cordial, my own recipe from the heritage blossoms, could be associated with such a collapse." There, Penelope," James said, his voice dropping into that deep, soothing register that always made Agatha want to either swoon or kick him. "Nobody blames the drink. It was likely his heart. The man lived on a diet of spite and suet." Agatha cleared her throat, a sharp, abrasive sound that cut through the sympathy like a chainsaw. "Actually, James," the inspector seemed quite interested in the glass. "And the foam. Very A is for arsenic, don't you think?" James looked up, his expression hardening. "Agatha, this is hardly the time for your amateur dramatics. Penelope is naturally distressed." "Oh, I can see that," Agatha said, her gaze raking over Penelope's perfectly styled blonde waves. "Distress looks very becoming on you, Penelope. Tell me, did you brew the cordial yourself, or did the Clean Living girls have a hand in it? Many hands make light work, but they also make it very hard to track who added the secret ingredient." Penelope's sobbing stopped abruptly. She straightened her back, her blue eyes flashing with a coldness that surprised even Agatha. "I prepared the base myself, Mrs. Raisin. The group only assisted with the bottling." "Are you suggesting something?" "I am suggesting that Arthur Pringle was about as popular as a slug in a prize cabbage," Agatha said, stepping closer and enjoying the way Penelope flinched at her bluntness. "And he was particularly vocal about your new allotment project, wasn't he? I heard him in the Red Lion last Tuesday. He called it a pseudo-scientific eyesore and threatened to have the parish council revoke your lease. Oh. Collective gasp went up from the nearby villagers who were accidentally eavesdropping. James looked at Agatha with a mixture of horror and grudging curiosity. Is that true, Penelope? James asked quietly. Penelope's lip trembled again, but this time it looked less like grief and more like calculated fury. Arthur was a traditionalist. He didn't understand the benefits of biodynamic planting, but I would hardly kill a man over a few square yards of soil. People have been murdered for less in the Cotswolds, Agatha remarked airily. Remember the great jam fiasco of '92? Or the poisoned marrow in Mercester? It's a hotbed of horticultural homicide. That's enough, Agatha, James snapped. You're being offensive. I am being observant, Agatha retorted, her face flushing. While everyone else is busy feeling sorry for the woman who provided the lethal refreshment, I am looking at the facts. Pringle was a bully. He had enemies, and he died right after taking a swing of her drink. She turned on her heel, her pride stinging from James' rebuke. She didn't head for her car, however. Instead, she circled the back of the refreshment tent, her London PR instincts telling her that the real story was always where the bins were kept. Behind the canvas, she found Mary Fortune, the woman whose jam had been disqualified earlier. Mary was a mousy, nervous woman who usually smelled of lavender and desperation. She was currently staring into a crate of empty cordial bottles, her hands shaking. Nervous, Mary? Agatha asked, stepping out from the shadows of a large oak tree. Mary jumped, nearly dropping a bottle. Matesse, I sin, you startled me. I was just helping clear up. Helpful, Agatha said, her eyes narrowing. She noticed Mary's fingernails were bitten down to the quick. Pringle was quite cruel to you today, wasn't he? Disqualifying your jam in front of everyone. Calling it insufficiently set. I'd have been tempted to throw the jar at his head. He was a hard man, Mary whispered, looking around frantically. But he's gone now. There's no point talking about it. Unless he didn't go of his own accord, Agatha pressed. Stepping into Mary's personal Spacia tactics shed used to great effect on stubborn journalists in her former life. Did you see anyone near the judge's podium before the ceremony? Anyone messing with the glasses? Mary's eyes darted toward the main tent. I saw Peter Higgins, the boy from the garage. He was delivering the crates. He was arguing with Mr. Pringle about the pumpkins. Mr. Pringle told him he'd never win as long as he was the judge. The diseased football's comment, Agatha mused. High stakes for a 20-year-old with a chip on his shoulder. But it wasn't just Peter, Mary added, her voice dropping to a barely audible hiss. I saw Penelope Larch talking to Mr. Pringle this morning. Behind the floral display. They weren't talking about flowers, Mrs. Raisin. They were arguing. She looked terrified. Agatha felt a surge of triumph. Terrified? Why? I don't know. I didn't hear. I just saw her face, Mary said, suddenly pushing past Agatha. I have to go. My husband will be wondering where I am. Agatha watched her scuttle away. Penelope Larch, the village's new golden girl, terrified of a toad-like horticultural judge. It didn't fit the image of the serene, organic goddess. Well, Agatha whispered, reaching into her handbag for a cigarette before remembering she'd quit for the third time that week to impress James. She settled for a piece of nicotine gum, chewing it with aggressive satisfaction. She had a suspect list: the vengeful jam maker, the insulted pumpkin grower, and the clean living queen with a secret. As she walked back toward her car, she saw Detective Inspector Wilkes talking to a constable near the cordoned-off podium. He caught her eye and shook his head in warning. Agatha ignored him, offering a sharp, dismissive wave of her hand. She didn't need the police. She had something better, a deep-seated need to be right, a burning jealousy of Penelope Larch, and a pair of very expensive binoculars back at the cottage. Let the police play with their fingerprint powders, Agatha muttered, climbing into her car. I'm going to find out what Penelope Larch was really brewing in that garden of hers. Chapter 4, Grease, Grudges and Great Pumpkins. The following morning, Carsely was draped in a deceptive golden peace. To any passing tourist, it looked like the quintessential English village, but Agatha Raisin knew better. Beneath the thatched roofs and climbing wisteria, the gossip was churning like a blender. Agatha, dressed in a sharp red trouser suit that made her look like a very fashionable fire engine, pulled her car into the forecourt of Higgins' garage. The air here didn't smell of roses, it smelled of old oil, burnt rubber, and masculine resentment. Peter Higgins was under the hood of a battered Land Rover. He was a lanky youth with a mop of unruly dark hair and a jawline that seemed permanently set in a position of defiance. Agatha approached, her heels clicking aggressively on the concrete. He didn't look up. Looking for Peter, Agatha announced, peering over the edge of the engine. You're looking at him, Peter grunted. He finally straightened, wiping a pair of blackened hands on an even blacker rag. He recognized Agatha immediately. Everyone in the village knew the London woman who lived in the cottage near the church and had a habit of sticking her nose where the locals preferred it wasn't. If it's about your brakes, I can't look at them until Thursday. My brakes are fine, Peter. I'm here about the pumpkins. Peter's expression shifted from irritation to a guarded, simmering anger. The pumpkins are dead, along with the man who insulted them. What's it to you? I saw you at the show, Peter. You were having a rather heated discussion with Arthur Pringle near the judges' table, Agatha said, her voice taking on that silky interrogative tone she had perfected while dealing with difficult journalists. He was quite a piece of work, wasn't he? Disqualifying your hard work because of a personal grudge. He was a mean-spirited old goat, Peter spat. Had been coming into the garage for years, complaining about the prices, complaining about the service. He told me my pumpkins were diseased just because he didn't like my father. He enjoyed making people feel small. And you wanted to make him feel small? Or perhaps not feel anything at all? Peter froze, the rag dangling from his hand. Are you accusing me of something, Mrs. Raisin? I am just observing that you had the motive, the opportunity since you were delivering the crates of drinks and certainly the temper, Agatha said, crossing her arms. I didn't kill him, Peter shouted, his voice cracking. I was angry, yeah. I told him he was a dinosaur and that I'd be glad when he retired. But I didn't put anything in that drink. I don't even like elderflower. Tastes like Grandma's perfume. Agatha studied him. He looked frightened, but it was the raw, clumsy fear of a boy who knew he was an easy target, not the calculated fear of a murderer. The police think it was a heart attack. Agatha lied smoothly, testing the waters. Then why are they asking who else touched the bottles? Peter retorted. Inspector Wilkes was here an hour ago. He took my fingerprints. He thinks because I'm the village lad with a loud mouth I must be a killer. Agatha felt a pang of unexpected sympathy. She knew what it was like to be the outsider, the person everyone was ready to blame because they didn't quite fit the village mold. Did you see anyone else near the judge's podium, Peter? Someone who didn't belong there? Peter hesitated, looking back at the Land Rover. I saw that woman. The one James Lacey hangs around with. Penelope Larch. Agatha's heart did a little somersault of joy. And what was she doing? She was checking the seals on the bottles, Peter said. She said she wanted to make sure they hadn't spoiled in the heat, but she looked jumpy. She nearly jumped out of her skin when I dropped a crate of ginger beer behind her. Jumpy? Agatha mused. Interesting. And there was something else, Peter added, leaning in slightly. After Pringle went down, in all the chaos, I saw her pick something up from the grass, near where the glass shattered. She tucked it into her pocket real quick. What was it? I don't know. Something small. Silver, maybe? Or glass. I didn't get a good look. Agatha thanked Hamer rare occurrence that left Peter looking bewildered and climbed back into her car. She felt a surge of adrenaline. Penelope Larch, the clean living queen, was looking more and more like a woman with a very dirty secret. As she drove back toward the village centre, she passed James Lacey walking his dog. He looked toward her car, and for a second, Agatha considered stopping and telling him everything. But the memory of him comforting Penelope at the show stung her pride. No, she would solve this herself. She would present him with the truth on a silver platter, and then he would see who the real amateur was. However, as she pulled into her driveway, her triumph was cut short. Standing by her front door was a woman she didn't recognize, a tall, elegant woman in a tailored navy suit, looking remarkably like a high-end solicitor. Miss Raisin? Raisin, the woman asked, her voice clipped and professional. I am. And you are? Imzara Pringle, Arthur Pringle's daughter. I understand you were the last person to interact with my father before he passed, and I understand you've been asking a great many questions about him. Agatha felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Sarah Pringle didn't look like a grieving daughter. She looked like a woman who was conducting a hostile takeover. I was merely assisting the police, Agatha said, her chin lifting. The police say it was natural causes, Sarah said, stepping closer. Her eyes were as hard as marbles. But my father's will is complicated, and I would suggest, Mrs. Raisin, that you stop stirring the pot. Some secrets are better left buried with the people who kept them. Agatha watched her walk away to a sleek Mercedes parked down the lane. Well, Agatha whispered, her hand trembling slightly as she reached for her keys. If the daughter is telling me to stop, it's a sign I'm definitely onto something. The obvious suspect might be Peter, but the list of people who wanted Arthur Pringle silenced was growing by the hour. And Agatha Raisin was never one to be told what to do. Chapter 5, The Crumb of Truth. Agatha Raisin was not a woman who apologized. In her former life as a London PR powerhouse, an apology was a strategic retreat, a calculated move to be deployed only when a client was caught with their hand in the proverbial till. In Carsely, however, she realized that smoothing things over was often the only way to get through a locked door. Her target was Penelope Larch. If James Lacey was going to persist in being a knight in safari jacket armor for the woman, Agatha decided she would play the role of the repentant neighbor. He'll be so charming she won't know what hit her, Agatha muttered to her reflection, applying a layer of lipstick that was slightly too aggressive for a morning call. She had stopped at the local bakery and purchased a dozen lemon drizzles. Back at the cottage, she had painstakingly transferred them to her own vintage floral plate, dusting them with a little extra icing sugar to hide the suspiciously uniform edges. It was a classic Agatha deception, store-bought soul masquerading as village virtue. Penelope's cottage, Wisteria Reach, was sickeningly perfect. The garden was a masterclass in organized chaos, with every bee seemingly on the payroll. When Penelope opened the door, she looked pale, wearing a soft cashmere cardigan despite the humidity. "Agatha," Penelope said, her voice sounding thin. "I wasn't expecting anyone." "Oh, I know," Agatha said, pushing her way in with a practiced, breezy smile. "I felt absolutely dreadful about our little spat at the show. Stress, you know, and that heat. I brought some of my homemade lemon drizzles. Thought we could have a peace tea." Penelope looked at the cakes, then at Agatha. A flicker of suspicion crossed her face, but she was too well-bred to refuse. Very kind of you. Come through." The sitting room was filled with the scent of dried herbs and expensive candles. It was exactly the kind of room Agatha hated, tasteful, quiet, and devoid of a single television remote. "I heard Arthur's daughter is in town," Agatha said, dropping into a chintz armchair before she was invited. "Sarah, cold fish Izentishi, came to my house yesterday, practically threatened me." Penelope, who was pouring tea from a heavy stoneware pot, froze. A small splash of brown liquid hit the white lace tablecloth. "She went to see you? Why?" "Oh, she's convinced her father's death is a matter of complicated wills and village gossip," Agatha said, watching Penelope closely. She seemed particularly interested in who was near the drinks. "I told her you were the picture of innocence, of course." Agatha hadn't told her anything of the sort, but she loved the way the lie made Penelope's hand tremble. "I'm sure the police will find it was just a tragic accident," Penelope said, her voice tight. "Of course," Agatha agreed, reaching for a cake. "Though Peter Higgins, you know the lad from the garage, is quite the talker. He mentioned seeing someone checking the seals on the bottles. Said they looked jumpy." The silence that followed was so heavy it felt as though the ceiling might cave in. Penelope sat down slowly, her tea untouched. "Peter Higgins is a delinquent," Penelope said, her organic goddess persona slipping to reveal a sharp, jagged edge. "He's bitter because Arthur saw through his pathetic attempts at gardening. If he's telling stories about me, he's lying to save his own skin." "Oh, I am sure," Agatha said, her mouth full of lemon drizzle. "But you know how people are. They love a villain, especially a beautiful one." It was a backhanded compliment, the kind Agatha excelled at, but it had the desired effect. Penelope's eyes snapped to Agatha's. For a second, the mask dropped completely. It wasn't grief Agatha saw, or even irritation. It was a cold, calculating fear. The misstep. Agatha, leaning forward to press her advantage, reached for the teapot. Her sleevey and oversized, fashionable silk affair caught the edge of a small, decorative wooden tray on the side table. The tray tipped, sending a collection of polished stones and a small ceramic vase clattering to the floor. "Oh, blast. I am so sorry," Agatha exclaimed, dropping to her knees to gather the items. "Don't!" "He'll get it," Penelope cried, her voice uncharacteristically shrill. She scrambled off her chair, but Agatha was faster. As Agatha reached under the edge of the sofa for a runaway marble, her fingers brushed something else. It was cold, metallic, and small. She scooped it up, thinking it was a fallen earring. It wasn't an earring. It was a small, silver-capped glass vial, no larger than a thumb. It was empty, but as Agatha's thumb brushed the rim, a faint, distinct odor wafted up. It wasn't elderflower. It was something bitter, like crushed almond shells, but with a chemical sharpness that made her nose twitch. "Give that to me," Penelope said. She was standing over Agatha now, her face shadowed. Agatha looked up, her heart hammering against her ribs. She saw Penelope's hand outstretched, her fingers twitching. In that moment, the social misstep of knocking over the tray had revealed a behavioral inconsistency far louder than any shout. Penelope Larch, the advocate of clean living and natural healing, was looking at a tiny, chemical-smelling bottle with the desperation of a junkie. It's my heart medicine," Penelope said, her voice smoothing out into a practiced lilt, though her eyes remained hard. "Vastari. It's a natural extract. I must have dropped it." Vastari, Agatha repeated, tucked the memory of the scent into the back of her mind. She handed the vial back, her smile now a brittle mask. "How interesting. I didn't know you had a weak heart, Penelope. You look so robust. Appearances can be deceiving, Agatha. I'm sure a woman of your experience knows that better than anyone." Agatha stood up, dusting off her trousers. The tea party was over. She had what she came for, not an apology, but a clue hidden in the scent of a natural remedy. "Well, I must fly," Agatha said, heading for the door. "James wanted me to look at some blueprints this afternoon. You know how he is. Can't make a move without a second opinion." It was a petty parting shot, and she knew it. As she walked down the garden path, she could feel Penelope's gaze burning into her back. Agatha got into her car and sat for a moment, her hands shaking. She knew that smell. It wasn't heart medicine. It was something Shed smelled once in a high-end London spa, something used in very small, controlled doses for skin treatments but in a concentrated form. She pulled out her phone and typed a quick message to a former contact in the beauty PR world. "Bill, it's Agatha. Owe me a favor. What's that stuff that smells like bitter almonds but iacent cyanide? Used in natural serums but can be toxic if ingested." As she waited for a reply, she saw James Lacey's car turn into the lane. He waved, but Agatha didn't wave back. She was too busy thinking about the heart medicine that Penelope Larch kept hidden under her sophond, why it smelled like the end of Arthur Pringle. Chapter 6. The bitter price of clean living. The ping of Agatha's smartphone sounded like a gunshot in the quiet of her cottage. She scrambled for it, nearly knocking over a glass of red wine that was significantly larger than any doctor would recommend. It was Bill. Bill, PR, Aggie, darling. Vastari isn't a heart med. It's the brand name for a boutique serum from that Swiss clinic you used to represent. It's based on concentrated amygdalin apricot kernel extract. To the natural crowd, it's a miracle cure for everything from crow's feet to cancer. To a toxicologist, it's a precursor to cyanide. In a concentrated vial, it wouldn't kill instantly, but it would cause respiratory failure and foaming within 10 minutes of ingestion. Why? Were you planning a career change into professional widowhood? Agatha's blood ran cold. The heart medicine Penelope had scrambled to hide was a bottle of slow-acting poison. But why? Penelope was beautiful, successful, and had the village's most eligible bachelor trailing after her like a golden retriever. "She has everything," Agatha whispered to her empty living room. "Unless she doesn't." The PR professional in Agatha knew that the more perfect the branding, the more desperate the reality usually was. She grabbed her handbag, checked her lipstick a shade called Trial by Fire and headed for the Red Lion. If there was a crack in Penelope's polished veneer, the village pub would be the place where the light got in. The Red Lion was thick with the smell of stale ale and the low hum of conspiratorial voices. The flower show death had been a boon for business. Agatha spotted Doris Simpson huddled in a corner booth with 2 other members of the Ladies' Society. Agatha slid into the booth next to Doris without an invitation. "Doris, darling, you look like you need a gin. My treat." Doris blinked, her eyes widening behind her spectacles. Agatha Raisin didn't treat people unless she wanted to skin them for information. "That's very kind, Agatha. It's been such a shock. Poor Arthur." "Poor Arthur was a slumlord in a tweed jacket," Agatha said, signalling the barman. "I've been doing some reading. He didn't just judge flowers, he owned half the commercial leases in the high street, didn't he?" Doris leaned in, her voice dropping to a thrill-seeking whisper. "He was a tyrant, Agatha. He was planning to double the rent on the clean living shop next month." Penelope was frantic. She's been pouring every penny of her divorce settlement into that place, but with the cost of organic kale these days, well, she was falling behind. "So, the goddess of the allotment is actually broke?" Agatha felt a shameful, delicious surge of triumph. "Worse than broke," interjected Mary Fortune, who had appeared at the edge of the table, clutching a shandy. Her eyes were rimmed with red. "He wasn't just raising the rent. He was going to sell the building to a developer, a budget supermarket chain. It would have ruined the village aesthetic and Penelope's life. Agatha's mind raced. And what about you, Mary? You seemed quite rattled yesterday. Did Arthur have his thumb on your scales too? Mary's face went the colour of a blanched almond. He held the mortgage on my husband's workshop. He told us if I didn't stop cluttering the village with my craft stalls, he'd call in the debt. He said we were social clutter. The man was a one-man wrecking ball, Agatha mused. The motives under the microscope. Penelope Larch, facing total financial ruin and social humiliation. Arthur was destroying her brand and her business. Mary Fortune, under threat of homelessness and losing her husband's livelihood. Peter Higgins, publicly humiliated and his family's business insulted. Sarah Pringle, the cold fish daughter who stood to inherit a massive, albeit controversial, real estate empire. But here's the thing, Agatha said, her voice sharp as a razor. Who would have the means? Peter Higgins has grease under his nails, not access to Swiss beauty serums. Mary, you're more likely to use a knitting needle than a vial of amygdalin. But Penelope. Agatha, you aren't suggesting Doris started, but Agatha was already standing up. She had seen a familiar safari jacket through the pub window. James Lacey was walking toward the village hall, looking troubled. I have to go, Agatha announced, leaving the half-finished drinks on the table. Duty calls. She caught up to James just as he reached the shadows of the old stone archway. James. Wait. He stopped, his expression weary. Agatha, if this is about the murder again, I really haven't the stomach for it. I've just come from speaking with Penelope. Shesh. She's very fragile. She's a liar, James. Agatha blurted out, her tactless London roots showing. She's broke, she was being evicted by Pringle, and she's got a bottle of poison hidden under her sofa. I saw it. Ah, James looked at her with a mixture of pity and annoyance that stung worse than any insult. Agatha, your jealousy is becoming unseemly. Penelope told me you forced your way into her home and started accusing her of all sorts of nonsense. She's terrified, and frankly, so am I. Of what you're willing to do to get attention. Agatha felt as if he had slapped her. Her pride, usually her strongest armour, suddenly felt paper-thin. I'm not jealous, James. I am right. Good night, Agatha, he said, turning his back on her. Agatha stood alone in the darkening lane, the scent of lavender and damp earth mocking her. She felt old, foolish, and desperately lonely. For a moment she considered going home, locking the door, and staying there until the whole village forgot she existed. But then she remembered the smell of the vial, the bitter, sharp scent of an apricot kernel. It was a clue that didn't care about James Lacey's opinion or Penelope's blonde curls. Fine, Agatha hissed into the night. Believe the fragile one. But when I prove she's a killer, don't expect me to be fragile about your apology. She turned and began walking not toward her cottage, but toward the Pringle estate. If the daughter, Sarah, was as cold as everyone said, she might just have the missing piece of the puzzle, Arthur's private records. Chapter 7. The shadow in the study. Agatha Raisin had spent much of her career in London convincing people that she was more important than she actually was. This required a certain level of audacity, the kind of audacity that was currently leading her to scale a low stone wall into the grounds of Pringle Manor at 10 o'clock at night. I am too old for this, she hissed, her expensive silk trousers snagging on a rogue branch of hawthorn. And far too well dressed. Pringle Manor was a dour, Victorian pile that looked as though it had been designed specifically to discourage joy. It sat on the edge of the village, looming over the smaller cottages like a headmaster waiting to hand out detentions. Agatha knew Sarah Pringle was staying there, but she also knew, thanks to a strategic phone call to the Red Lion, that Sarah was currently dining with the chief constable in Mercester. It was the perfect time for a bit of light breaking and entering. Agatha reached the rear of the house. The library window was a sash variety, and Arthur Pringle, for all his obsession with other people's business, had been remarkably lax about his own security. With a bit of shimmying and a prayer to the gods of dry cleaning, Agatha managed to slide the window up and tumble into the room. The air inside was thick with the smell of old paper, pipe tobacco, and a faint, lingering trace of the same bitter almond scent she had encountered at Penelope's. Bingo, she whispered. She switched on a small penlight. The room was a monument to Arthur's greed. Ledgers were stacked high on a mahogany desk, and the walls were lined with maps of the village, many of them marked with aggressive red excess. Agatha moved to the desk, her heart drumming a frantic beat against her ribs. She began leafing through a file labelled commercial leases. Carsely High Scent. It was all there. Penelope Larch was not just behind on her rent, she was 3 months in arrears. and Pringle had been sending her increasingly vitriolic letters. One, dated only a week ago, read, "Your natural charms will not suffice to balance your books, Miss Larch. Vacate by the 1st, or the bailiffs will assist you." "Nasty little toad," Agatha muttered. "Ah." But as she dug deeper, she found something that didn't fit the narrative of Penelope as killer. In a separate, locked drawer which Agatha opened with a surprisingly effective letter opener, she found a folder marked Vastari Holdings. Inside were documents relating to a Swiss investment firm. It wasn't a skincare company. It was a private medical research group. And the largest shareholder wasn't Penelope Larch. It was Sarah Pringle. Agatha stared at the papers. Sarah hadn't just come to town to settle her father's estate. She was the one who had introduced the Vastari products to the village, using Penelope's Clean Living group as a front to test the marketer, perhaps to hide something darker. Suddenly the front door creaked open. Heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway. Agatha froze. Her first instinct was to bolt for the window, but the footsteps were already approaching the library. With a desperation born of social terror, she scrambled under the massive mahogany desk, tucking her knees to her chest. The door opened. The light flickered on, stinging Agatha's eyes through the gap in the desk's modesty panel. "I know you're in here," a voice said. It wasn't Sarah Pringle. It was deep, masculine, and terrifyingly familiar. Agatha held her breath, her face pressed against the cold wood. Through the gap she saw a pair of sturdy, polished brogues. They weren't the chief constable's shoes. They were James Lacey's. "Agatha," James sighed, sounding more disappointed than angry. "You can come out now. I saw your car parked half a mile down the road. You really aren't built for stealth." Agatha crawled out from under the desk, her hair disheveled and a streak of dust across her nose. "Oh." She tried to regain her dignity by smoothing her trousers, though the effort was largely symbolic. "I was investigating, James, which is more than I can say for you, standing around playing the gallant protector to a poisoner." James looked around the room, his eyes lingering on the open files. "I didn't come here to protect Penelope. I came because I grew suspicious myself. Sarah Pringle called me this evening. She asked if I knew where her father kept the Vastari records. She sounded frantic. Because Sarah's the one behind it," Agatha cried, waving a handful of papers. "She's the shareholder. Penelope was just the distributor face for the village. Pringle must have found out that his own daughter was running a scam or worse, and he was going to expose her. That's why he was closing the shop. Not because of the rent, but because of what was being sold there." James took the papers from her, his expression darkening as he read. "If Sarah is the money behind Vastari, then she's the one with the access to the concentrated extract. Penelope might have been a puppet, but Sarah is the puppeteer. And Arthur was the one person she couldn't bully," Agatha added. "So she silenced him, right in front of the whole village, using Penelope's drink as the perfect cover." "It's a theory," James said, though he looked genuinely impressed. "But we need proof, real proof, not just papers in a desk." A sudden, sharp click sounded from the doorway. They both turned. Sarah Pringle stood there, framed by the dark hallway. She wasn't wearing her navy suit anymore. She was in a dark raincoat, and in her hand she held a small, professional-looking spray bottle. "You really should have stayed in London, Mrs. Raisin," Sarah said, her voice devoid of emotion. "Oh, Mr. Lacey really should have stayed out of other people's family business. My father was a small-minded man who was going to ruin a multi-million-pound merger over a moral objection to a little chemical enhancement." She raised the spray bottle. "The police are expecting a heart attack," Sarah whispered. "2 more sudden collapses in a dusty library will be tragic, but hardly suspicious given the heat." Agatha felt a surge of pure, unadulterated panic. Her pride, her jealousy, her desire for James had all vanished, replaced by the primal need to survive. "James!" Agatha screamed, grabbing the heavy glass inkwell from the desk and hurling it with all the force of a woman who had been rejected one too many times. The inkwell missed Sarah's head but shattered against the doorframe, spraying black ink everywhere. In the split second of Sarah's instinctive flinch, James lunged forward. Chapter 8. A dead end at the bridge, James Lacey's lunge was remarkably graceful for a retired military man. But Sarah Pringle was faster. As the heavy glass inkwell shattered against the doorframe, spraying a constellation of black ink across the floral wallpaper, Sarah ducked. She dropped the small spray bottle, which clattered to the hardwood floor and rolled under a heavy mahogany credenza, and bolted down the darkened hallway with an unladylike burst of speed. "Stop her!" Agatha shrieked, scrambling up from the floor and desperately trying to brush the dust from her silk trousers. It was a futile gesture. The trousers were ruined, which only fueled her outrage. James swore softly, scrambling to his feet and giving chase, but by the time he reached the front door, the heavy oak was already slamming shut. Seconds later, the frantic crunch of tires on gravel echoed through the night air, followed by the roar of a high-end engine speeding down the manor's long driveway. "She's getting away," Agatha panted, joining James on the front step. "And she's probably taking the rest of the poison with her." "Let her go, Agatha," James said, his chest heaving as he stared into the darkness. He ran a hand through his hair, looking at Agatha with a mixture of exasperation and grudging respect. "We have the files. We have the motive. We need to call Inspector Wilkes immediately and explain exactly what we were doing breaking into a dead man's study." Agatha winced. "Let's emphasize the civic investigation aspect, shall we? I'd rather not spend the night in a Mercester holding cell. The lighting in those places is famously unflattering." Despite her bravado, Agatha's hands were shaking. The reality of the situation was settling over her like a damp, heavy blanket. This wasn't a PR crisis to be managed with a clever press release. Sarah Pringle had genuinely intended to kill them to protect her Swiss investment scheme. "Come on," James said gently, placing a hand on the small of her back, a gesture that sent a deeply inappropriate thrill through Agatha despite the circumstances. "Well, take my car." They hurried down the lane toward James's vehicle. The Cotswold night, usually so serene and full of the rustling of badgers, now felt sinister. They had just reached the edge of the village, where the road narrowed and crossed the ancient Carsely stone bridge, when James suddenly slammed on the brakes. Agatha pitched forward against her seatbelt. "James!" "What on earth?" "Look," he interrupted, his voice tight. Illuminated by their headlights, skewed sideways across the narrow bridge, was Sarah Pringle's sleek silver Mercedes. Its front bumper was crumpled against the medieval stone parapet. The driver's side door hung wide open like a broken wing, and the horn was blaring in a continuous, deafening wail. Agatha felt a cold knot form in her stomach. She crashed. James grabbed a heavy torch from his glove box and stepped out into the night. Agatha hesitated for only a fraction of a second before her insatiable curiosity overpowered her common sense. She unbuckled her belt and followed him into the chilly air. The blaring horn was a physical assault on the ears. James reached the open door and leaned inside, wrestling with the steering column until the noise abruptly cut off, leaving a ringing silence broken only by the hiss of the Mercedes radiator. Agatha stepped up beside him, her breath catching in her throat. Sarah Pringle was slumped sideways across the passenger seat, her dark raincoat twisted around her. But she hadn't been thrown by the impact. There was no blood, no shattered glass on her perfectly styled hair. Her face was turned toward the dome light, and her expression was frozen in a mask of sheer, unadulterated terror. And then Agatha smelled it. Wafting from the plush leather interior of the car was the distinct, sharp, and bitter aroma of crushed almonds. It was far stronger than it had been in Penelope's cottage or Arthur's study. "James," Agatha whispered, taking a step back. "Don't touch her." James had already pulled his hand away from Sarah's neck. No pulse. But the airbag didn't deploy, Agatha. The crash was low speed. This impact didn't kill her. "It was the Vastari," Agatha said, her mind spinning wildly as she stared at the dead woman. "She was poisoned." "But she was the one holding the poison in the study," James said. His brow furrowed in deep confusion. "She was trying to use it on us. Why would she ingest it herself while fleeing?" "She wouldn't," Agatha said slowly, the terrifying realization dawning on her. She looked past the car, into the dense, dark tree line bordering the river. Sarah hadn't been the mastermind. Or, if she was, she wasn't acting alone. Someone had known Sarah was at the manor. Someone who knew the police were circling. Someone who recognized that the wealthy heiress was panicking, making mistakes, and becoming a liability. "She didn't take it willingly," Agatha said, her voice barely a whisper. "Someone was waiting for her in the car, or they laced the air vents before she got in. She was dead before the car ever hit the bridge." James stared at her, the gravity of the situation etched into the lines of his face. If Sarah didn't kill Arthur Pringle, then who did? Agatha shivered, pulling her jacket tighter around her shoulders. The village of Carsely had suddenly transformed from a petty battlefield of flower shows and gossip into a hunting ground. The true killer was still out there, hiding behind a polite smile, and they were far more calculating, ruthless, and invisible than Agatha had ever imagined. And worse, she realized with a sickening jolt of her pride, she had been entirely, spectacularly wrong. Chapter 9, the PR pitch and the poisoner Agatha Raisin stared into her black coffee with the profound despair of a woman who had just seen her reflection under the fluorescent lights of the Mercester police station at 3 in the morning. Inspector Wilkes had been apoplectic. He had lectured Agatha and James for 2 solid hours about tampering with crime scenes, breaking and entering, and generally being a menace to the constabulary. Agatha had been forced to endure it all with her ruined silk trousers and a bruised ego. She had been wrong about Sarah Pringle. Gloriously, embarrassingly wrong. I handed the real killer a perfectly wrapped distraction, Agatha muttered to her empty kitchen. She took a sip of the bitter coffee, her mind churning. If Sarah was the investor, she was the one with the money. But who had the local knowledge? Who had access to Arthur's glass at the flower show? And who knew Sarah was at the manor last night? Suddenly, Agatha slammed her mug down on the granite counter. Penelope, she breathed. It was so obvious it burned. Penelope Larch hadn't been Sarah's puppet, she had been the mastermind. Sarah had provided the Vastarith poison masquerading as a miracle cure, but Penelope had been the one distributing it, building her clean living empire on a foundation of toxic Swiss imports. Arthur found out and threatened to expose the shop. Penelope spiked his cordial. And when Sarah panicked, threatening to confess and cut off the funding, Penelope slipped into the manor grounds and silenced her too. Penelope's entire Personarth fragile, organic, helpless village Newcomer was a masterclass in PR. And nobody hated a rival PR campaign more than Agatha Raisin. She played James like a finely tuned violin, Agatha said, a surge of vindictive energy replacing her exhaustion. And she nearly played me. Agatha didn't call James. If she told him her theory, he would insist on going to Wilkes, and Wilkes would plod along with warrants and forensics while Penelope quietly destroyed the remaining evidence. No, Agatha needed a confession, and she knew exactly how to extract one from a woman who worshipped the bottom line. She needed to set a trap. An hour later, Agatha walked down Carsley High Street looking like a heat-seeking missile in a tailored emerald green blazer and towering heels. Her hair was sharp, her lipstick was weapons-grade crimson, and her PR armor was fully engaged. She pushed open the door to Nature's Bounty, Penelope's organic shop. The bell tinkled cheerily. The air inside smelled cloyingly of lavender, eucalyptus, and expensive lies. Penelope was standing behind the rustic wooden counter, arranging a display of overpriced oat soaps. She looked up, her expression tightening for a fraction of a second before melting into a mask of tragic weariness. "Agatha," Penelope sighed, putting a hand to her chest. "I heard about poor Sarah Pringle. James told me this morning. It's just too horrific. To think another heart attack, or whatever it was." "Let's drop the act, Penelope." "The shop is empty," Agatha said, her voice dropping to a low businesslike purr. She walked over to the door, flipped the sign to closed, and smoothly slid the deadbolt into place. Penelope's eyes narrowed. "What are you doing?" "I'm here to negotiate," Agatha said, strolling toward the counter and leaning against it. "I was in Arthur Pringle's study last night, before Sarah interrupted us. I took something from the Vastari file before we fled." Agatha reached into her blazer pocket and pulled out a folded piece of heavy cream paper. It was actually her dry cleaning receipt, but she kept the blank side facing Penelope. "It's the Swiss ledger, darling," Agatha lied smoothly, tapping the paper. "I know Sarah was funding your little shop. But more importantly, I know you were skimming off the top. You were selling the Vastari concentrate to private clients in London for double the price, weren't you? Arthur found out you were operating an illegal, unlicensed pharmacy out of his building, and Sarah found out you were stealing from her." Penelope stared at the folded paper. The fragile, breathless village girl was vanishing before Agatha's eyes, replaced by a woman whose gaze was as cold and sharp as cracked ice. "You're bluffing," Penelope said, her voice devoid of its usual melodic lilt. "Am I?" Agatha laughed, a harsh, cynical sound. "The police think Sarah died of a heart attack, just like her father, but I know she was poisoned with amygdalin. The same poison that was in the vial you so clumsily dropped in your living room. The police don't know that. James doesn't know that. Only I do." Penelope's hands slowly lowered to the counter. "And why haven't you told your handsome, interfering inspector?" "No money in telling the police," Agatha said, adopting the most mercenary smile she could muster. "I'm a businesswoman, Penelope. I'm retired, bored, and frankly my cottage needs a new roof. I don't care that you killed Arthur was a beast, and Sarah was going to ruin everything. You protected the brand. I respect that." Agatha leaned in closer, dropping the bait. "I want 30% of the Vastari profits. In exchange, I burn this ledger, and I point Inspector Wilkes in the direction of Peter Higgins. The boy has the motive, and I can easily plant the idea that he tampered with Sarah's car." Silence stretched between them, thick and venomous. Agatha's heart hammered against her ribs. If Penelope called her bluff, Agatha had nothing. She was locked in a shop with a double murderer. Penelope tilted her head, studying Agatha with genuine appreciation. You know, Agatha, I always thought you were just a loud, desperate woman chasing after James Lacey. James is a hobby, Agatha lied, ignoring the painful twinge in her chest. Money is a lifestyle. Penelope let out a short, dark laugh. She reached beneath the rustic counter. 30% is steep, Agatha. I was thinking a lump sum would be much cleaner. When Penelope's hand re-emerged, she wasn't holding a checkbook. She was holding a heavy stone pestle, and her eyes were fixed dead on Agatha's skull. Chapter 10, The Price of Wellness. Agatha Raisin had faced down hostile corporate boards, aggressive journalists, and furious ex-wives, but none of them had ever swung a solid granite pestle at her head. Penelope Larch lunged across the rustic counter with a speed that entirely belied her fragile persona. Agatha shrieked, a thoroughly unchic sound, and threw herself backward. A heavy pestle missed her nose by a fraction of an inch and crashed into a meticulously arranged pyramid of Himalayan healing crystals. They shattered with a satisfying, expensive crunch. "Have you gone mad?" Agatha yelled, scrambling backward, her emerald heels skidding on the polished oak floorboards. "You should have just taken the money and kept your mouth shut, Agatha," Penelope hissed, rounding the counter. Her blonde hair was unraveling from its perfect chignon, and her blue eyes were wide and manic. Arthur Pringle was a dinosaur. He didn't understand the wellness market. He saw my private client ledger and called it a toxic, unregulated scam. He was going to expose me and evict me in the same afternoon. Agatha darted behind a freestanding display of organic bath bombs. "So you spiked his cordial with your precious Vastari extract," she shouted, grabbing a handful of lavender-scented spheres. "And Sarah? Did she find out her investment was being used to murder her father?" Sarah was a coward, Penelope spat, advancing slowly, the pestle gripped tightly in her white-knuckled hand. She panicked. When the police started asking questions, she called me from the manor. She said she was going to tell Wilkes everything, that we were importing concentrated amygdalin under the guise of skincare. I couldn't let her destroy my brand. "Your brand is murder!" Agatha threw a bath bomb. It hit Penelope square in the shoulder, exploding in a puff of lilac dust. It didn't slow her down. "It's exclusivity," Penelope corrected, wiping lavender dust from her cheek with a frighteningly calm smile. "London women pay thousands for the Vastari miracle. I wasn't going to let an old country bumpkin and his neurotic daughter take that away from me. I'm certainly not going to let a washed-up, jealous PR hack do it either." Agatha felt a flash of pure, indignant rage. "Washed up? Ill of you know my firm was highly respected," Agatha snapped. She backed up against the heavy glass of the shop's front door. She was trapped. Penelope raised the heavy stone pestle, her face twisting into a mask of ugly, desperate violence. "Goodbye, Agatha. I'll tell James it was self-defense. He always believes me." "Actually," Agatha said, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs, but her PR-trained smile snapping firmly into place. "I wouldn't bet your organic oats on it." Agatha raised her wrist and deliberately, dramatically tapped the face of her gold Cartier watch. It was 10:05 a.m. Right on cue, the shop's front door handle rattled violently behind Agatha. Penelope froze. "Penelope! Cooey!" came the unmistakable booming voice of Doris Simpson through the glass. Agatha said there was a secret half-price sale on the anti-aging serums for the Ladies' Society. "Open up, dear, it's boiling out here." Penelope's eyes darted to the door. Through the frosted glass, the silhouettes of at least a dozen Carsely women were visible, pressing against the storefront like a well-dressed siege engine. "A secret sale," Penelope whispered, her pristine image fracturing entirely. "What have you done?" "I am a PR woman, Penelope," Agatha panted, stepping away from the door. "I know how to guarantee an audience, and I also know how to leave a voicemail." Agatha reached into her blazer pocket and pulled out her smartphone. The screen was brightly lit, showing an active, ongoing call. The contact name on the screen read, James Lacey. "He's been listening for the last 4 minutes," Agatha said triumphantly. Every word. "Ah, the Vastari, Arthur, Sarah." The whole exclusive confession. The colour drained entirely from Penelope's face. The heavy stone pestle slipped from her fingers, hitting the floor with a dull thud. Suddenly, the bell above the door jingled wildly as the lock clicked open note from the inside, but from a key turning on the outside. James Lacey pushed his way into the shop, followed immediately by Inspector Wilkes and 2 uniformed constables. Behind them, Doris Simpson and the Ladies' Society gasped in collective, horrified delight at the scene. James looked from the shattered crystals to the pestle on the floor to Penelope, who immediately burst into practiced, beautiful tears. "James, thank goodness," Penelope sobbed, taking a step toward him. She went crazy. She started throwing things and threatening me. James didn't step forward to catch her. He looked at her with a cold, devastating clarity. "I heard everything on the phone, Penelope. Don't make it worse." Inspector Wilkes stepped past James, pulling a pair of handcuffs from his belt. "Penelope Larch, I am arresting you on suspicion of the murders of Arthur and Sarah Pringle. You do not have to say anything." As Wilkes read her rights, the village women whispered furiously, their social dynamics instantly recalibrating. The goddess of clean living was being hauled away in cuffs, her face smeared with lavender dust and defeat. Agatha stood amidst the wreckage of the shop, straightening her emerald blazer with shaking hands. She felt bruised, exhausted, and desperately in need of a gin. But as she caught Jamis athirst over the heads of the gossiping villagers, she saw something that made it all worthwhile. He wasn't looking at Penelope anymore. He was looking at Agatha. Oh, and for the first time all week he looked thoroughly, genuinely impressed. Chapter 11, The Laurels and the Loneliness. A week later, the oppressive Cotswold heatwave finally broke, washed away by a torrential summer downpour that left the village of Carsely smelling of wet stone, damp wool, and bruised geraniums. Inside the Red Lion, however, the atmosphere was warmer and infinitely more vibrant than it had been in months. Agatha Raisin sat at the best table near the unlit fireplace, wearing a triumphant silk blouse the colour of crushed sapphires and nursing a large, perfectly iced gin and tonic. She was holding court, and she was enjoying every single ego-stroking minute of it. "I always said there was something unnatural about that woman," Doris Simpson declared, leaning over her half-pint of cider. "Nobody can be that perfectly blonde and digest that much raw kale without hiding a deep, dark secret. I said it to the vicar just last month, didn't I, Mrs. Bloxby?" Mrs. Bloxby, the vicar's wife, offered a gentle, non-committal smile that managed to be polite without actually endorsing a lie. "It has been a terrible shock to the village, Doris, though we are all incredibly grateful to Agatha for stepping in and nearly getting her head bashed in with a rock," muttered Peter Higgins, who had paused by their table. The young mechanic looked uncomfortable in the pub setting, twisting a grease-stained rag in his hands, but he looked directly at Agatha. "Look, Mrs. Raisin, I know I was mouthy the other day, but Inspector Wilkes told me the whole story. If you hadn't caught her out, Wilkes would probably still have me in a cell for tampering with that Mercedes." Agatha waved a manicured hand, trying to look appropriately modest and failing completely. "Think nothing of it, Peter. Just consider my brakes a priority the next time I bring the car in." "Top of the list," Peter promised, cracking a rare, genuine smile before retreating to the dartboard. Agatha took a satisfied sip of her gin. Penelope Larch was currently residing in a Mercester holding cell, entirely stripped of her organic skincare routine and facing double murder charges. The Vastari smuggling ring had been blown wide open, making the regional papers. And the clean living shop on the high street was boarded up, awaiting a new tenant. It was a complete and utter victory. Yet beneath the crisp silk of her blouse, Agatha felt a familiar, hollow ache. The thrill of the chase had evaporated, leaving behind the quiet, unglamorous reality of her everyday life. The pub door swung open, letting in a gust of cool, damp air. James Lacey walked in, shaking the rain from his umbrella. He was wearing a navy wax jacket and looked ruggedly, unfairly handsome. He scanned the room, his eyes locking onto Agatha's table. Doris Simpson suddenly found her empty glass fascinating. "Well, look at the time. I must go and check on the casserole." "Coming, Mrs. Bloxby." Mrs. Bloxby gave Agatha a knowing, soft look, patted her hand, and followed Doris out. James walked over and pulled up a chair, settling into it with a weary sigh. He didn't offer to buy her a drink, he just sat there, looking at her with a remarkably intense expression. "I spoke to Wilkes this afternoon," James began, his voice low enough that the nearby tables couldn't eavesdrop. "He's still furious about the breaking and entering at the manor, but he asked me to pass along his begrudging gratitude. The phone call you staged in the shop gave them exactly the probable cause they needed to arrest her before she destroyed the vials." "Wilkes is a plodder," Agatha said, lifting her chin. "But I suppose he has his uses. Handcuffs, mostly." James smiled, a slow, genuine curve of his lips that made Agatha's stomach do a complicated flip. "You were brilliant, Agatha. Reckless, infuriating, and completely out of line. But brilliant." "I told you she was a liar," Agatha pointed out, unable to resist a tiny bit of gloating. "You did," James conceded smoothly. He looked down at the table, tracing the condensation on Agatha's glass. "I owe you an apology. I allowed myself to be taken in by a very practiced act. I saw someone who looked vulnerable, and I wanted to help. I completely underestimated her ruthlessness. Enged, I underestimated you. Agatha's heart hammered a frantic rhythm. This was it, the moment she had been waiting for all summer. He was apologizing. He was looking at her with respect. Now he would ask her to dinner, just the two of them, perhaps at that nice French place in Mercester. You're a force of nature, Agatha, James continued, standing up and buttoning his jacket. And Carsely is certainly less dull with you in it. But I think I've had enough excitement for one season. I'm going up to Scotland for a few weeks. A friend has a fishing lodge. Need to clear my head. Agatha froze, her carefully constructed PR smile suddenly feeling brittle and tight. Scotland? How nice for you. When do you leave? First thing tomorrow, James said. He reached out and awkwardly patted her shoulder, a gesture one might give a reliable spaniel. Keep out of trouble while I am gone. I make no promises, Agatha managed to say, her voice impressively steady. Oh, she watched him walk out of the pub, the heavy oak door swinging shut behind him. The warmth of the room suddenly felt oppressive. The victory tasted flat. Agatha finished her gin in one long swallow, grabbed her handbag, and stepped out into the damp Cotswold evening. The street lamps cast long, lonely shadows across the wet cobblestones. She walked back toward her picture-perfect cottage, the silence of the village pressing in on her ears. She had saved the day. She had proven herself smarter than the police, sharper than the competition, and tougher than a murderer with a granite pestle. But as she turned the key in her empty house, the heavy silence greeted her like an old, unwanted friend. Agatha walked to the mirror in the hallway and stared at her reflection. She saw the lines around her eyes, the expensive haircut, the fierce, unyielding pride that kept her going when everything else fell away. To hell with him, she whispered fiercely to the glass. And to hell with his fishing trip. She squared her shoulders, lifted her chin, and marched into the kitchen. Tomorrow was a new day. There was a vacant shop on the high street, a village full of secrets, and Agatha Raisin was not a woman who stayed bored or beaten for long. Chapter 12. The silent files, and the next sent Agatha woke up to the sound of a very aggressive Cotswold pigeon cooing on her windowsill. It was Tuesday. James Lacey was in Scotland, probably freezing in a river in rubber waders, and Agatha was in Carsely, facing the terrifying prospect of a blank calendar. She threw off the duvet, marched to the mirror, and critically examined her chin. You solved a double murder, she told her reflection firmly. You do not pine for men who prefer trout to your company. Oh. She dressed in a sharp, navy blue trouser suit that screamed London efficiency, even if her only destination was her own kitchen. After brewing a pot of coffee strong enough to strip paint, she carried it to the small mahogany desk in her living room. During her PR days, Agatha had kept meticulous dossiers on rival firms, difficult clients, and journalists who needed managing. Carsely, she had realized over the past few weeks, was no different. It was simply a smaller, more vicious corporate boardroom masquerading as a picturesque hamlet. She opened a heavy drawer and pulled out a stack of pristine manila folders. She took her favorite fountain pen silver Mont Blanc she had bought herself after a particularly grueling campanade, wrote the silent files in bold, sweeping letters across the tab of the first folder. Into it, she slid the newspaper clippings regarding Penelope Lark's arrest, a copy of the Vastari Holdings report shed snagged from the manor, and a few scribbled notes about Arthur Pringle's real estate empire. If I am to be the village watchdog, Agatha muttered, taking a sip of the bitter coffee, I might as well be organized about it. The act of filing gave her a sense of control. She wasn't just a lonely, retired woman puttering around a cottage. She was a woman who knew things. She knew the grudges, the finances, and the secrets buried beneath the polite smiles of her neighbors. Feeling moderately restored, Agatha grabbed her raincoat and a sturdy umbrella and headed out toward the village shop. It was still drizzling outside, the kind of fine, irritating English rain that ruined a good salon blowout in seconds. The bell above the shop door clattered as she entered. The air inside smelled of damp dog, floor wax, and Mrs. Simpson's lavender water. Doris Simpson was already standing at the counter, deep in conversation with Mr. Patel, the shop owner. I'm just saying it's highly irregular, Doris was whispering, though her stage whisper could easily carry across a cricket pitch. To move in before the ink is even dry on the lease. And after what happened there, Agatha's ears pricked up instantly. She shook out her umbrella and sauntered over to the counter, casually picking up a tin of overpriced Scottish shortbread. Who is moving in, Doris? Agatha asked, affecting an air of mild boredom. Doris jumped. Good morning. We were just discussing the old clean living shop. You know, Penelope's old place. Doris lowered her voice, leaning in conspiratorially. A new tenant arrived this morning. A man from London. He's opening an antique bookshop of all things. Agatha raised a perfectly penciled eyebrow. A bookshop in Carsely. Hell go bankrupt in a month. The only thing people read around here is the parish newsletter and the warning labels on weed killer. Well, he certainly doesn't look like he's short of money, Doris noted, a slight flush rising to her cheeks. Drove up in a vintage Jaguar. Betty, distinguished looking. Silver hair, tailored tweed. Asked me where he could get a decent cup of espresso. Doris scoffed. I told him he was in the wrong county. A Londoner, you say? Agatha said, a spark of genuine interest igniting in her chest. Yes, his name is Charles. Charles Pemberton, Mr. Patel chimed in, ringing up Agatha's shortbread. He asked about you, actually, Mrs. Raisin. Agatha froze, her hand halfway to her purse. About me? Why on earth would he ask about me? Mr. Patel shrugged. He said he read about the Flower Show murders in the Mercester Echo. Said the article mentioned a former London PR executive who broke the case. He wondered if you might be interested in helping him with some local marketing for his grand opening. Agatha felt a slow, triumphant smile spread across her face. James Lacey might be off standing in a freezing Scottish stream, successfully avoiding her. But here was a new London-era man with a vintage Jaguar and a need for her specific set of skills. More importantly, he had read about her brilliance in the papers and sought her out. Did he now? Agatha murmured, handing Mr. Patel a £10 note. Well, it is only neighbourly to welcome new business to the high street. She took her shortbread and stepped back out into the drizzle. Suddenly, the rain didn't seem quite so dreary. The village of Carsely stretched out before her, full of nosy neighbours, petty grievances, and a handsome new arrival who already knew exactly how clever she was. Agatha clutched her umbrella like a sword, her emerald green heels clicking a sharp, victorious rhythm on the wet pavement. She would go home, review her newly minted files to ensure her local knowledge was razor sharp, and then she would pay Mr. Charles Pemberton a visit. She was Agatha Raisin. She didn't wait for life to happen to her. She orchestrated it. And if this new antique dealer thought he could survive the social minefield of the Cotswolds without her, he was in for a very rude awakening. Let James have his fish. Agatha had a new client to manage, and potentially a whole new village drama to unearth.